There is a file in the Galactic Research Consortium's database, classification-level Crimson, access restricted to senior staff and the emotionally stable, that contains exactly one photograph of a Venom Titan in the wild. The photograph was taken from a distance of 400 meters. With a long-range lens, by a researcher who, according to the accompanying notes, was already running when he took it. That photograph has since been used in 17 different interspecies psychological resilience studies, 2 horror exhibitions, and 1 very ill-advised children's book that was recalled within 48 hours. The Venom Titan in the photo is not doing anything particularly threatening. It is simply standing there, looking at something off camera with an expression that, on a human face, might read as mild curiosity. On a Venom Titan's face, if face is even the right word for that arrangement of armored plating, sensory stalks, and approximately too many teeth, that expression reads as an extinction-level event waiting to select its coordinates. The file's official advisory, printed in 7 galactic languages, and the color red reads, "Do not make eye contact." Specialist Marcus Reyes read that file on a Tuesday. By Thursday, he was petting the Titan like it was a golden retriever who'd had a rough week. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Kiva Station, a mid-tier research outpost orbiting a dim star at the ragged edge of the consortium's mapped territories, was not the kind of place that attracted the bold or the ambitious. It attracted the thorough, the patient, the kind of scientists who were content to spend 3 years cataloging atmospheric particulates and considered a good lunch an event worth noting in their personal logs. It was, in the estimation of its 43 crew members, a quiet posting. Then the shuttle from the Meridian Hub docked at Bay 4, and Specialist Marcus Reyes walked through the airlock with a duffel bag over one shoulder, a thermos of coffee in his hand, and the specific energy of someone who considered this posting an opportunity. Station Commander Vreth, a saloon, which meant he had 4 arms, a bioluminescent stripe down the center of his chest that changed color with his emotional state, currently a deep, apprehensive amber, and 42 years of experience in off-world research, met him at the dock with his senior. Team. The briefing took place in the main observation lounge. It was delivered by 3 of the station's longest-serving crew, Vreth himself, senior xenobiologist Dr. Pak Atuian, approximately the size and shape of a large filing cabinet, with a voice like stones grinding together, and the station's safety officer, Ensign Liss Affray, small and silver-furred, whose species had evolved on a planet with 73 distinct apex predators and had, consequently developed the most sophisticated threat response nervous system in the known galaxy. They had prepared materials. There were charts. Vreth began at the beginning, which was the station's purpose, multi-species biological research cataloging the native organism of the surrounding system, and proceeded with methodical care through the station's protocols, its emergency procedures, its meal times, its recreational facilities. Marcus nodded, drank his coffee, and watched all 3 of them with the particular attentiveness of someone waiting for the important part. Then, Vreth reached Sublevel 9. His bioluminescent stripe went from amber to a pale, resigned white. The station, he said, is also home to a research subject that was transferred to our custody approximately 14 months ago at the consortium's request. The subject is, he paused, in the way of someone choosing words the way you choose your footing on ice, categorized as a priority crimson containment specimen. "It's a Venom Titan," said Dr. Pock, who had not evolved a filter. Liss made a small, involuntary sound and looked at the door. Marcus set down his coffee. "What's a Venom Titan?" The three of them looked at each other. Then, they showed him the photograph. Marcus studied it for a long moment. The creature in the photo was enormous. Even at 400 meters, even at this scale, the sheer architectural mass of it was evident. 12 feet of layered chitin and muscle, built low and wide, like something that had decided gravity was a suggestion. The sensory stalks, 8 of them, fanned out from the crown of its head like a dark halo, were each independently articulated, capable of detecting electromagnetic fields, thermal signatures, and chemical traces simultaneously. The forelimbs ended in what the file later described as manipulator claws, which was a very calm scientific term for something that looked like it could open a starship whole the way you'd peel an orange. Marcus looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he asked, "Does it have a name?" Vreth's stripe went completely dark. Liss left the room. Dr. Pock stared at Marcus with all 6 of his eyes, which among Tulians was the expression for "I have made a terrible mistake inviting this person into my life." "It does not," said Vreth, very carefully, "have a name." Marcus nodded slowly, as if this explained a great deal. "Okay," he said. "I'd like to read its full file." The Venom Titan's consortium database entry was 37 pages long. This was not because there was a great deal known about the Venom Titan. It was because an astonishing number of those pages were dedicated to describing what happened to the researchers who had tried to find out. Marcus read the whole thing in one sitting, in the station's small library bay with a second cup of coffee and the focused expression of someone reading a thriller that was also technically a warning. The creature, his creature, though he had not said this out loud yet, being at his core tactful, was the sole surviving specimen of a species native to the heavy-gravity moon of Wrath 7, a place the consortium's initial survey team had described as a world that appears to have optimized, through millions of years of evolution, for the production of things that will kill you. The Venom Titan was the thing at the top of that world's food chain. It massed approximately 800 kilograms. Its chitin plating, the layered exterior armor of interlocked biological plates, had been tested at a hardness that shrugged off standard-grade plasma discharge. Beneath the plating, the musculature was dense, fast twitch, and apparently tireless. Endurance testing in the file noted, with a certain shell-shocked prose style, that the specimen had maintained full sprint speed for 6 continuous hours before the researchers had given up measuring and simply gone home. The venom itself, the reason for the name, the reason for the crimson classification, the reason Liss had left the room, was delivered via the manipulator claw tips, the tooth surfaces, and in a touch that Marcus felt showed genuine creative commitment, the fine sensory hairs along the leading edge of the forelimbs. It was a narrow paralytic compound of extraordinary sophistication that worked on the nervous systems of 47 distinct species, a number that the file noted with academic admiration was statistically improbable for a naturally occurring biochemical agent, and suggested the Venom Titan's prey. Base had historically included most of the known galaxy's visitors to Wrath 7. The electromagnetic pulse capability was, if anything, worse. Not because of the scale, it was localized, close range, but because of the targeting precision. The specimen had, on 2 separate occasions, selectively disabled recording equipment, while leaving the researchers attached to that equipment technically functional. The file used the word selectively, with the quiet horror of people who had expected a blunt instrument and found a scalpel. 14 researchers. The file was careful about this. It listed them in an appendix with their species and credentials. It did not editorialize. It did not need to. 14 researchers across 3 separate facilities before the specimen had been transferred to Kiva Station, which was remote enough, the file suggested, that further casualties would at least not be embarrassing to the consortium. The final containment assessment described bars made of a titanium chromite alloy rated to 300 kilonewtons of sustained force. The assessment noted, in a tone of scientific resignation, that the specimen had produced scratch marks on the interior of the bars. The marks were consistent with the manipulator claw morphology. They did not penetrate the alloy. They were nonetheless there. The file concluded with the official multi-species advisory printed again in 7 languages. Do not make eye contact. Do not approach the containment perimeter. Do not attempt vocalization in the presence of the specimen. Marcus closed the file. He sat for a moment, coffee in hand, looking at nothing in particular. Then, he went to find Dr. Pock and asked him, very pleasantly, what the feeding schedule was and who was responsible for it. Pock looked at him for a long time with all 6 eyes. A drone, he said. We use a drone. From the corridor. With the blast door sealed. Marcus nodded. How long has it been since anyone went into Sublevel 9? 11 months, said Pock. Ha, said Marcus. Pock, who had not survived 40 years of Xenobiology by ignoring his instincts, spent the rest of that afternoon quietly checking the containment locks. The alarm went off at 034 station time. Vreth came awake with the practice speed of a commander whose bioluminescent stripe immediately went full emergency red, was already pulling on his 2nd pair of arms worth of uniform before his eyes had fully focused, and arrived at the security station to find Pock already there. All 6. Eyes on the monitor bank, his stone-grinding voice reduced to something barely above a whisper. He's gone, Pock said. Marcus's bunk empty. His tracking signal active, its location Sublevel 9. Vreth stared at the screen. Get Liss, he said. They went down in a group of 7, Vreth, Pock, Liss, who had gone the color of old chalk, and 4 security personnel who had been thoroughly briefed and were moving with the specific posture of people who desperately wanted to be somewhere else but were too professional to say so. They didn't go in. Nobody suggested going in. They went to the observation post, the reinforced monitoring alcove that looked down into Sublevel 9's corridor via a bank of cameras sealed behind 3 layers of blast shielding. Vreth pulled up the feed. The containment unit at the end of the corridor was intact. Bars in place, locks engaged, alloy undamaged. Marcus Reyes was sitting cross-legged on the floor approximately 2 meters from the bars, his back straight, his hands resting open on his knees, talking. Not loudly, not nervously. The audio pickup was clear enough to hear his tone, if not every word. Low, steady, unhurried. The vocal quality of someone reading aloud to himself or narrating a slow walk through a garden. Pressed against the bars, not pushing, not straining, but resting against them, its massive armored body angled toward him, its 8 sensory stalks curved forward like a question mark, was the Venom Titan. The silence in the observation alcove was total. One of the security officers made a sound that was not a word in any language. Liss had both hands pressed over her mouth. Pock was recording. Because Pock was, at his core, a scientist, and his body knew what to do even when his brain had stepped outside for air. On screen, Marcus said something that made the sensory stalks shift. A slight, coordinated tilt, like sunflowers tracking light. The Titan's head moved, settling against the bars with what, in any other creature, would have been called leaning in. "He's going to die," whispered one of the security officers, in the flat tone of someone watching the inevitability. Vreth's stripe was a color no one had a name for. He pressed the intercom. "Specialist Reyes." His voice came out almost level. Almost. "Step away from the containment unit. Step away now." On screen, Marcus looked up at the nearest camera. He raised one hand, calm, acknowledging the universal gesture of, "I hear you, I'm fine, give me 1 second." Then he turned back to the Titan, said something else, and slowly, deliberately stood up. He walked to the corridor door, keyed it open from the inside, and came up to join them in the observation alcove. His expression was thoughtful. His hands were steady. He was completely, thoroughly, infuriatingly fine. This made the sound of someone whose entire evolutionary heritage was catching up to them all at once. "Specialist Reyes," said Vreth, and stopped, because he had prepared approximately 40 things to say in this moment, and all of them had just evaporated. He started again. "What," he said, with precision, "were you doing?" Marcus looked back through the observation glass at the Venom Titan, which had settled back from the bars but had not moved away. It was still oriented toward the corridor door through which he had left. "Introducing myself," he said. They put him in the briefing room and asked him to explain himself, which he did at length with a calm that the assembled crew found more unsettling than panic would have been. "It started," Marcus said, "with the scratch marks." He gone back to the file. The scratch marks on the interior of the containment bars. Everyone had read them as escape attempts, force testing, aggression, frustration. But he'd looked at the photographic documentation in the appendix, which was very good, because someone had been thorough enough to document the pattern before concluding it was aggression and moving on. The marks were not random. They were not distributed the way force testing left marks, which tended to cluster at stress points, at the structural weaknesses the testing organism was trying to exploit. These marks were distributed evenly, rhythmically, in groups of 3, like tapping, like knocking, and the electromagnetic pulses, he said. Everyone had been treating them as a defense mechanism, a threat display, a weapon. But he'd pulled the raw log data, and he meant the full logs, not the summaries. And the pulses had a pattern, not random, not reactive. They came on a cycle, roughly every 40 minutes, a repeating sequence of 4 pulses. Pause. 4 pulses. Pause. Short, long, short, long. "That's not a weapon discharge pattern," he said. "That's more like a heartbeat signal," said Pak. Everyone looked at him. He looked back, all 6 eyes set. "I know what it is," he said, in a voice that was quiet in the way of someone who has just realized something unfortunate about themselves. "I cataloged those pulse logs 8 months ago. I noted the pattern. I filed it under anomalous defensive behavior. Cause unknown." He stopped. "I should have looked harder." Marcus nodded, without judgment. It was trying to communicate. It's been trying to communicate for, based on the earliest logs, at least a year. Maybe longer. The room sat with that, and you decided, said Vreth slowly, that the appropriate response was to go to Sublevel 9 alone at 3 in the morning. "I went at 3 in the morning, said Marcus, because that's when it's quiet, and I didn't want it to feel crowded. The first contact principle. You are not a first contact officer. I grew up with 4 dogs, said Marcus, and a horse, and at one point, an extremely territorial goose that I will tell you about another time, because it's relevant to methodology. Vreth stared at him. His stripe was doing something that, in 42 years, it had never done before. It was cycling. Just slowly, helplessly cycling through colors. Commander, said Marcus, and his voice shifted slightly, still calm, but with a depth of seriousness underneath it that hadn't been there in the same way before. It's alone. It's been alone in that room for over a year. It's an intelligent creature. The electromagnetic communication alone suggests cognitive architecture well beyond instinctual behavior, and it has had nothing. No stimulus, no response, no contact. The aggression. The 14 researchers. He paused. I think we've been reading it wrong from the start. I think what we've been seeing isn't predatory behavior. Then what is it? Asked Liz, very quietly. Marcus looked at the table. Fear, he said. Escalating fear responses in an isolated, unstimulated, highly intelligent animal. It's been terrified and alone for over a year, and it's been trying to talk to us, and nobody's answered. The room was silent for a long time. That, said Dr. Pock at last, is either the most important xenobiological insight anyone has had in this station's history. He paused. Or it is a comprehensive delusion that will result in significant casualties. Yeah, said Marcus. I know. That's why I want to run a formal test. It took 6 days to get approval, which, given that the application went to both the station commander and the consortium's regional oversight board, was actually faster than anyone expected. Pock's formal endorsement helped. Vreth's carefully worded cover letter, which took him 4 drafts to write and was, by the end, a remarkable document expressing profound institutional reservations while simultaneously acknowledging that the preliminary evidence was, in his words, difficult to categorically dismiss, helped more. The approved protocol was a full-team observation event. Marcus in a hazmat suit rated to both chemical and electromagnetic exposure. 1 security officer at the door, armed, with orders to act if the biometric readings from Marcus's suit spiked into critical range. The rest of the crew at the observation post. A kill switch that would drop 4 tons of blast doors in under a second. Nobody said good luck to Marcus on the day. A few people looked at him in a way that he thought might have been goodbye, and he appreciated the honesty of it. He walked into Sublevel 9 alone. The corridor was longer than it looked on the monitors. The lights were dimmed, he'd asked for that, and Vreth had allowed it, grimly, and the air had a quality to it, cold and heavy, with something chemical he couldn't name, that sat differently in the chest than ordinary recycled station air. His own footsteps were careful and deliberate. He stopped outside the containment unit. The Venom Titan was at the back of the space. Not hiding, the enclosure wasn't large enough for that, but positioned the way a large animal positions itself when it's uncertain, rear protected, facing the entry point, every sensory stalk oriented forward. Watching him. Marcus stood still. This was rule 1 of every piece of animal behaviorism he'd ever been taught. By professors, and by the 4 dogs, and the horse, and the territorial goose. Let them look. Don't rush the look. The look is information exchange, and you are not in charge of its pace. He stood still for 2 full minutes. In the observation alcove, nobody breathed. The Titan moved, not toward him. Sideways, a slow repositioning like recalculation. The sensory stalks shifted. Marcus watched them and let himself be watched and did not move. Then he sat down, cross-legged, the way he had the first night. hands open on his knees. Not because the posture was militarily defensible, it wasn't, but because it was the posture of someone who was not about to run. And he had found, with the 4 dogs and the horse and the goose, that the posture mattered more than almost anything else. The body knew things that the brain forgot to say. He started talking, the same way he had the first night. Low, steady, unhurried. He told it about the dogs, actually. He figured he'd start there, since they were thematically relevant. Told it about the big one, Rosie, who'd been pulled from a shelter and had taken 3 months to accept being touched, who'd spent those 3 months watching Marcus with big amber-brown eyes from corners of rooms, doing her own version of the look, until one morning she'd patted over and shoved her enormous head against his knee, and that had been that. The Titan had not moved from the back of the space. Marcus kept talking. He talked about the horse, whose name had been Edison, and who had been objectively brilliant and difficult in equal measure, and who taught him that intelligence and trust were not the same thing. That intelligence, in fact, sometimes made trust harder, because the intelligent creature had better reasons to be afraid. The Titan's sensory stalks moved. Still not toward him, but differently. Attentive. Marcus talked about the station, about the star outside, about what he'd been like as a kid, which was not a story he usually told, but he found himself telling it because the words were just something for his voice to carry. And the voice was the point. Steady, warm, unhurried, answering every one of the electromagnetic pulses he could feel, distantly, through his suit's sensors. 23 minutes in, the Titan moved. 3 steps forward. Slow, deliberate, no sudden shifts of weight. In the observation alcove, Liss made a sound so small it wasn't audible, just the shape of one. Marcus did not move, did not change his voice, did not change his breathing. 2 more steps. It was close now, close enough that he could see, in detail he hadn't had from the file photos, the texture of the chitin plating, the micro scarring across the front panels that the file hadn't mentioned. The way the sensory stalks, this close, were not black, but a very deep, iridescent green-blue, shifting with its movement like oil on water. It looked down at him. He looked up at it. Let them look. One of the 4 limbs came down. Slowly. The manipulator claw, which he was not professionally going to think about in detail right now, extended toward him, not striking. Reaching. Marcus lifted his hand. He placed it open-palmed against the side of the claw. Let it rest there. Warm chitin and the faint electrical charge he could feel even through the hazmat suit, like static before a storm. Silence. Then the Titan lowered its head. A long, slow movement, the 8 stalks folding back to rest, the enormous armored skull settling until it was level with his face, and then lower, and then it pressed, with a gentleness that was somehow more astonishing than anything else. Gently, like something that had been waiting to ask. Permission into the space beneath his arm. Marcus put his hand on top of its head. The electromagnetic pulse that came then was different. Not 4 beats. Not the repeating sequence. Just one long, sustained emission that his suit logged as unclassified behavioral event, and that he filed privately under hello, finally, hello. In the observation alcove, the silence broke. Not into words, just into the sounds that people make when the world rearranges itself around a moment they didn't know they were waiting for. Pack was recording. He was also, though he would not mention it in his report, crying, which for Tulians meant a thin, bioluminescent sheen appearing at the edges of the eye clusters, which he would attribute to equipment malfunction if anyone asked. Nobody asked. Vreth's stripe was the color it turned when he was overwhelmed by something that had no category yet, which was a color it had only ever turned twice in his life before today. Liz was gripping the observation rail with both hands and both secondary hands, all 4 sets of knuckles pale, and she was smiling the smile of someone who has spent their entire existence in justified terror of the universe, and has just, briefly, been given a reason to revise. The formal report filed by Kiva Station on the 7th day after the controlled interaction event, as it was officially designated in the careful language of people who were not ready to call it what it was 49 pages long and constituted what Dr. Pock described, with visible satisfaction, as the most significant xenobiological contact documentation in the consortium's current operational cycle. The Galactic Research Consortium's Regional Oversight Board responded in 4 days with a communique that managed, in diplomatic language, to express simultaneous profound scientific excitement and profound institutional panic. The 2 feelings were arranged in alternating paragraphs like a document that had been written by 2 different people who were not speaking to each other. 3 formal complaints were filed. 1 from the Tulian Science Directorate, which felt the event had been conducted with inadequate multi-species oversight. 1 from the Frey Biological Ethics Board, which raised concerns about researcher endangerment protocols. 1 from the Saloon Exploration Authority, which objected on grounds that were, Vreth admitted privately, more about the fact that it was a human who done it than about anything the human had actually done. Marcus received, in the same data packet, a formal commendation from the consortium's Xenobiological Research Division and a mandatory psychological evaluation order from its Safety Compliance Office. He completed the evaluation. He was, the evaluating officer noted in their report, psychologically unremarkable in all assessed parameters, which was either reassuring or concerning depending on your framework, and he was cleared for continued research. The psychological evaluator had also, at the end of the session, asked him one off-record question. Were you afraid? Marcus had thought about it for a genuine moment. Before, he said, not during. Why not during? Because it was scared, he said. And something can't really scare you and need you at the same time. You just have to decide which one you're going to answer. The evaluator wrote something in their notes and did not share what it was. The Venom Titan, which Marcus had named Rex simply and completely, on the day after the interaction event in a notation in his personal research log that Dr. Pock had insisted on adding to the official scientific record over Vreth's quiet objection, began showing measurable behavioral changes within the first 2 weeks. Feeding intake increased by 30%, rising to what the file's baseline projections had estimated as a healthy maintenance intake for a specimen of its mass. The electromagnetic pulse sequences shifted from the distress cycle pattern to something Pock's analysis characterized as complex, variable, and consistent with voluntary communicative behavior. The scratch marks on the containment bars did not accumulate new additions. The consortium sent a specialist team at the 8-week mark, 3 xenobiologists and a behavioral analyst from the core systems, with the official brief of assessing the situation. They arrived and spent 2 days reviewing Pock's documentation, watching the observation feeds, and speaking to the crew. On their 3rd day, they were present in the observation alcove when Marcus ran his daily session. The daily sessions had evolved, still cross-legged on the floor, still the steady, unhurried voice, but with additions, physical items brought in and presented. Objects of varying texture, temperature, material, to the manipulator clause for examination. A slow and patient and mutually constructed vocabulary of electromagnetic signals mapped against behaviors, building something that was not yet language and was no longer just noise. Pock was developing a decoding framework. He worked on it for 6 hours a day and described it with totally an understatement as the most interesting problem I have had in my career. The specialist team watched the session in silence. Rex pressed his head into Marcus's arm, which he did every session now, the same greeting, settled and sure, like something that had been given a structure it could rely on. After the session, the lead specialist, a Tulian of considerable reputation, who had spent 30 years studying interspecies cognition, found Vreth in the corridor and said, without preamble, he shouldn't be alive. I know, said Vreth. The statistical probability of that first approach succeeding? I know. The specialist looked through the observation glass. Rex had stayed where Marcus had left him, which he did most days. The sensory stalks were at rest, angled the way they angled when he was, as best anyone could interpret it, calm. Does he know how unlikely it was? The specialist asked. Vreth considered this. I asked him, he said. Once. He said he wasn't thinking about likelihood. He was thinking about what he saw in front of him. And what did he see? Something alone, he said, that was trying to be found. The specialist left on schedule, with 3 data drives of documentation and the expression of someone who had their certainties rearranged. Their formal report to the consortium recommended expanded research funding, a protocol review of Venom Titan classification standards, and, in a final recommendation that was noted as unprecedented in the report's category, ongoing behavioral research under the current primary researchers. Oversight, with strong advisement against reassignment. Marcus was not reassigned. Weeks became months. The Kiva Station crew, who had not signed up for historic xenobiological firsts, and generally would have preferred to continue cataloging atmospheric particulates in peace, found themselves changed in ways that would take time to understand. Liz, who had been terrified of Rex since before the beginning and who had not fully stopped being terrified, began attending the sessions as an observer, first for 5 minutes, then 10, then longer. She never went into the containment corridor. She sat at the observation post with her secondary hands folded in her lap, watching, and the fear on her face was still there, but it had company now. Something else. Quieter, that she recognized from her own species history as the feeling that came after a very long time of being afraid. When something turned out to be, if not safe exactly, then worth it. Pock's decoding framework was 2/3 complete and growing. The electromagnetic vocabulary had 37 consistent signal behavior correlations. Pock believed, with the careful confidence of a scientist who had done his work, that within 6 months they would have something that could reasonably be called a conversation. Rex had learned to tap the bars in response to Marcus's voice. 3 times, which meant, I hear you. The scratch marks on the bars, re-examined now with new eyes, told a different kind of story than they had before. On an unremarkable Tuesday evening, 3 months after the interaction event, 2 members of the Kiva crew sat in the observation alcove after Marcus's session had ended. Marcus had left. Rex was settled in the center of the containment space, the sensory stalks at rest, and the slow, regular electromagnetic pulse of his resting state moved through the monitors like a heartbeat, which it was. One of them was ensignless. The other was a junior researcher named Tane, a saloon of 24 who'd been posted to Kiva 6 weeks prior and was still in the process of understanding what he'd arrived into. They sat in the quiet for a while. Do you think he knew he was going to survive? Tin asked. His stripe, was the soft, curious blue of youth. That first night, when he went down there alone. Liz thought about it. She was quiet for long enough that he wondered if she was going to answer. "I think," she said finally, carefully, that it didn't occur to him to ask. Ten looked at her. "Isn't that the same as being reckless?" Liz watched Rex through the glass. The sensory stalks, the slow pulse. "No," she said. "I've thought about this a lot." She paused. "Reckless means you know the risk and don't care." He just looked at something frightening and saw something that was frightened. And then the question of his own survival wasn't the first question anymore. She stopped. "I don't know if that's courage. I think it might just be what humans are." Tane was quiet for a moment. On the monitors, Rex's resting pulse ticked on, steady and even. "Do you think they'll let him stay here indefinitely?" he asked. "I think," said Liz, "that you would need a very large team and a very compelling argument to separate those two at this point." She said it in the tone of someone who had run the numbers. Through the reinforced glass, in the dim and quiet of Sublevel 9, the last of the Venom Titans breathed in the steady rhythm of something that had been found, and the monitors recorded it faithfully, and the station turned slowly around its dim and distant star, and nobody in the known galaxy had yet agreed on what any of it meant. Marcus, asked for his own assessment in the official documentation, had written 4 words. He just needed company.